Eminences, Excellencies, and friends, good morning to all of you. I'm Strobe Talbot of the Brookings Institution. I want to extend a particular welcome to Your Eminence, Archbishop Demetrios of America, who was kind enough to grace these presences as recently as March 25th, which happens to be Greek National Day. Welcome back, Your Eminence. It's not every day that we have an event here at Brookings in the presence of so many religious leaders. And our main speaker today certainly so qualifies. But the Ecumenical Patriarch is also a leader on an issue of vital importance to all mankind, of whatever faith. So while his mission and his message are rooted in his spiritual calling, they also resonate with the world of public affairs, politics, and diplomacy as well. Your All Holiness, I should add that I welcome you here for personal reasons as well. 4 months ago, you received my son Adrian, who is here with us today, and me in your office at the Fanar on the Golden Horn of the Bosporus. That makes me particularly glad to be able to reciprocate your hospitality today. In addition, I field a close and long-standing tie to our other distinguished guest, who will introduce His All Holiness in a moment. Nearly 16 years ago, I had to run a gamut of United States senators as part of the process of seeking confirmation for a post in the Department of State. And I remember very vividly, more vividly than just about any other such meeting I had, the one that I had with Paul Sarbanes. He was not interested in grilling me on my views regarding various hotspots of the world. Rather, he wanted to draw me out on my appreciation of America's identity as a melting pot, as a nation of immigrants, a nation that is, in its very essence, to use two Greek words, cosmopolitan and ecumenical. In the years that followed, I always found Senator Sarbanes to be a source of wise counsel and, of course, straight from the shoulder and always constructive criticism, or what I called to him a moment ago, tough love. I was also struck by his style, which was not typical of the branch of government where he served for 36 years, 6 in the House, 30 in the Senate. That style was, as I suspect we're about to be reminded, spare, as in Spartan, and laconic, as you'd expect from someone whose father came from Laconia. But he could also be passionate and, most important, persuasive when it came to issues that he cared about. Those included the pursuit of peace and stability in the Balkans and southeastern Europe. In addition, he advocated making the issue of environmental degradation a priority concern for American diplomacy. He continues to promote that cause today. That was apparent 2 weeks ago when he spent 5 days at a symposium in New Orleans. That symposium was convened by His All Holiness, and it brought together scientists, environmentalists, and religious leaders to discuss the Mississippi River as one of the world's great natural resources imperiled by pollution and climate change. And I might add that all of the causes associated with Paul Sarbanes' career are Brookings causes as well, past, present, and future. Like the Ecumenical Patriarch, Paul has managed to move back and forth between the secular world and the realm of religious faith. The divide between those two worlds is represented at either end of Massachusetts Avenue. Exactly 18 blocks east of here is the United States Capitol, which the tourist brochures call the Cathedral of Democracy, another Greek word, of course. And then, exactly 18 blocks to the west, is St. Sophia Greek Orthodox Church, or Cathedral, where Paul himself has sometimes worshipped. So I hope that Paul will agree that it's fitting for him and his All Holiness to find common ground here at Brookings, exactly halfway between the two institutions that have meant so much to Paul in his life. And I will close by saying that I also hope that the message that the Ecumenical Patriarch has for us this morning will be as persuasive up on Capitol Hill as Senator Sarbanes was so often persuasive when he served there with such distinction in the Cathedral of Democracy. Paul, over to you.
Panayotite, Your Eminences, Reverend clergy, ladies and gentlemen. Actually, I must say in the beginning, I never realized that Brookings was located equidistant from the U.S. Capitol and St. Sophia Cathedral. I always had great respect for this institution, but it's now going up very substantially, I have to say, here this morning. It's a very deep personal honor for me to have the opportunity to introduce His All Holiness, Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, a truly visionary religious leader whose message of peace and respect for the sanctity of our environment has touched millions. Patriarch Bartholomew is a spiritual leader of Orthodox Christianity, which numbers 300 million communicants throughout the world. The institution he heads, and he's now, this week marks his 18th anniversary, his enthronement as Patriarch. The institution he heads, the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople, is one of Christianity's most ancient entities and has been located in what is now present-day Istanbul, Turkey, for nearly 17 centuries. To many, His All Holiness is known as the Green Patriarch for his outspoken advocacy of protecting our physical environment, God's creation. It is a title well-deserved, as I was just privileged to participate in his 8th environmental symposium. These environmental symposiums began about 15 years ago, or held every other year, associated with a body of water. It started with the Aegean, then we did the Black Sea, the Danube, the Adriatic, the Baltic Sea, the Amazon, the Arctic, and now here in America at New Orleans. And we had the Great Mississippi River Restoring the Balance Symposium, and witnessed the inspirational leadership of His All Holiness in rallying support for preserving our environment. The Patriarch attended every session of the symposium, along with the Archbishop and the other hierarchs, but he was a constant presence, participant in those sessions. The Patriarch is also recognized as a leader in the dialogue between religions as a path to peace and freedom for the world's people. Shortly after the tragedy of 9/11, he convened a meeting of Christian and Muslim leaders to find ways of alleviating division and violence caused by distortions of religious beliefs. As he has said, war in the name of religion is war against religion. His pilgrimage for peace and dialogue has taken him across the world and given hope and encouragement for those who seek understanding and mutual respect among all peoples. He is particularly committed to the cause of religious freedom and minority rights, as his own life and pastoral existence have been lived under difficult and at times oppressive conditions. The Patriarch recognizes, as did our country's founders, that religious freedom and minority rights are an essential component of a democracy, and that without these rights, no country can truly be called free. Yesterday, the Patriarch was received by President Obama. After this talk, he will be the guest of Speaker Pelosi and Majority Leader Reid at a luncheon on Capitol Hill, and he will attend dinners tonight and tomorrow night hosted by the Vice President and by the Secretary of State. But we are greatly honored this morning that the Patriarch has included in his mission of peace, justice, and environmental balance, Brookings, one of our nation's leading institutions devoted to understanding public issues and to meaningful dialogue for the betterment of mankind. In that spirit, I am pleased to present His All Holiness Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew.
Please. Your Eminences and Your Graces, esteemed President Strobe Talbot, Senator Sarbanis, distinguished guests, good morning, everybody. It is a pleasure and a privilege to address members and guests of this renowned center of political study and thought. At first glance, it may appear strange for the leader of a religious institution concerned with spiritual values to speak about the environment at a secular institution that deals with public policy. What exactly does preserving the planet or promoting democracy have to do with saving the soul or helping the poor? It is commonly assumed that ecological issues, global climate change, and the exploitation of nature resources are matters that concern politicians, scientists, technocrats, and interest groups. The Ecumenical Patriarchate is certainly no worldly institution. It wields no political authority. It leads by example and by persuasion. And so, the preoccupation of the Orthodox Christian Church, and in particular, her highest spiritual authority, the Ecumenical Patriarchate, with the environmental crisis, will probably come to many people as a surprise. But it is neither surprising nor unnatural within the context of Orthodox Christian spirituality. Indeed, it is now exactly 20 years since our revered predecessor, Ecumenical Patriarch Demetrios, sparked the ecological initiatives of our Church by issuing the first encyclical encouraging our faithful throughout the world to pray for and preserve the natural environment. His exhortation was subsequently heeded by the member churches of the World Council of Churches and many Roman Catholic dioceses and organizations. What then does preserving the planet have to do with saving the soul? Let us begin to sketch an answer by quoting an Orthodox Christian literary giant, Fyodor Dostoevsky, echoing the profound mysticism of Isaac the Syrian in the 7th century through Starec Zosima in the Brothers Karamazov. Love all God's quotation, love all God's creation, the whole of it and every grain of sand. Love every leaf, every ray of God's light. If you love everything, you will perceive the divine mystery in things. Everything is like an ocean, I tell you, flowing and coming into contact with everything else. Touch it in one place and it reverberates at the other end of the world. This passage illustrates why, with respect to the priority and urgency of environmental issues, we do not perceive any sharp line of distinction between the pulpit and this lectern. One of our greatest goals has always been to weave together the seemingly disparate threads of issues related to human life with those related to the natural environment and climate change. For as we read the mystical teachings of the Eastern Church, these form a single fabric, a seamless garment that connects every aspect and detail of this created world to the Creator God that we worship. For how can we possibly separate the intellectual goals of this institution, namely the advancement of democracy, the promotion of social welfare, and the security of international cooperation, from the inspirational purpose of the Church to pray, as we do in every Orthodox service, for the peace of the whole world, υπέρ της ειρήνης του σύμπαντος κόσμου, for favorable weather and abundance of the fruit of the earth, ευκρασίας αέρων, εφορίας των καρπών της γης, and for the safety of all those who suffer. Over the past 2 decades of our ministry, almost 2 decades, we have come to appreciate that one of the most valuable lessons to be gained from the ecological crisis is neither the political implications nor the personal consequences. Rather, this crisis reminds us of the connections that we seem to have forgotten between previously unrelated areas of life. It is a kind of miracle, really, and you don't have to be a believer to acknowledge that. For the environment unites us in ways that transcend religious and philosophical differences, as well as political and cultural differences. Paradoxically, the more we harm the environment, the more the environment proves that we are all connected. Our dear friend Strobe Talbot in New York last week, during the 9th annual Orthodox Christian prayer service sponsored by the Eastern Orthodox and Ancient Oriental Churches for the United Nations community, spoke of the need to redefine the international or global community beyond the horizons of our lifespan. The global connections that we must inevitably recognize between previously unrelated areas of life include the need to discern connections between the faith communities. We must also perceive the connections between all diverse disciplines. Climate change can only be overcome when scientists and activists cooperate for a common cause. And finally, we can no longer ignore the connections in our hearts between the political and the personal. The survival of our planet depends largely on how we translate traditional faith into personal values and, by extension, into political action. That is why The Orthodox Church has been a prime mover in a series of interdisciplinary and interfaith ecological symposia held on the Adriatic, Aegean, Baltic, and Black Seas, along the Amazon and Danube rivers, as well as on the Arctic Ocean, as Senator Sarbanis already told us. The last of these symposia concluded only a few days ago in New Orleans, seeking ways to restore the balance of the great Mississippi River. The mention of New Orleans brings to mind another truth. Not only are we all connected in a seamless web of existence on this third planet from the sun, but there are profound analogies between the way we treat the Earth's natural resources and the attitude we have toward the disadvantaged. Sadly, our willingness to exploit the one reflects our willingness to exploit the other. There cannot be distinct ways of looking at the environment, the poor, and God. This is one of the reasons why we selected New Orleans as the site of our latest symposium. And this is why our visit there was, in fact, the second since the devastation of Hurricane Katrina. There, images of poverty abound, too close for comfort. We witnessed them in August of 2005 on the Gulf of Mexico. They are still evident over 4 years later, not only sealed forever in our memory, but soiling the World 9 to this day. How could the most powerful nation on earth appear so powerless in the face of such catastrophe? Certainly not because of lack of resources, perhaps because of what Saint Seraphim of Sarov once called lack of firm resolve. The truth is that we tend, somewhat conveniently, to forget situations of poverty and suffering. And yet we must learn to open up our worldview. We must no longer remain trapped within our limited, restricted point of view. We must be susceptible to a fuller and a global vision. Tragically, we appear to be caught up in selfish lifestyles that repeatedly ignore the constraints of nature, which are neither deniable nor negotiable. In New York, Secretary Talbot referred to the need for the singular I to reflect the plural we, that is to say, the ecumenical or global reality. We must relearn the sense of connectedness, for we will ultimately be judged by the tenderness with which we respond to human beings and to nature. Surely, one area of common ground where all people of goodwill, of all political persuasions and every social background can agree is the need to respond to those who suffer. Even if we cannot or refuse to agree on the root causes and human impact on environmental degradation, even if we cannot or refuse to agree about what would define success in sustainable development, no one would doubt that the consequences of climate change on the poor and disadvantaged is unacceptable. Such denial would be inhuman at the very least and politically disadvantageous at worst. Of course, poverty is not merely a local phenomenon. It is also a global reality. It applies to the situation that has existed for so long in such countries as China, India, and Brazil. To put it simply, someone in the so-called third world is the most impacted person on the planet. Yet that person's responsibility is incomparably minute. What that person does for mere survival neither parallels nor rivals our actions in the so-called first world. Many argue that the wealthy nations of the West became so by exploiting the environment. They polluted rivers and oceans, razed forests, destroyed habitats, and poisoned the atmosphere. But now that the poorer nations are developing and improving the quality of life for their citizens, like the West did during the 19th century and the 20th century, all of a sudden, the rules are being changed and developing nations are being asked to make sacrifices that the nations of the West never made as they were developing. They are being asked to reduce their impact on the environment, in other words, to curb their development. They are being asked to drive fewer cars, consume less oil, build fewer factories, raise fewer forests, and harm fewer habitats, all in the name of protecting the environment. Brothers and sisters, this simply cannot be. Not only is it unfair to ask the developing nations to sacrifice when the West does not, it is futile. They care not what we say, they watch what we do. And if we are unwilling to make sacrifices, we have no moral authority to ask others who have not tasted the fruits of development and wealth to make sacrifices. Fortunately, the West, and in particular America, is now showing that it recognizes this inconvenient truth, to remember Al Gore, that if we are to save our planet, sacrifices must be made by all. The Obama administration, as you know, has been very active in this regard. The President has signed an executive order challenging government agencies to set 2020 greenhouse reduction goals and using the government's $500 billion per year in purchasing power to encourage development of energy-efficient products and services. There are also many promising developments at the global level. Representatives of the 16 countries that emit the highest levels of greenhouse gases met recently in London to discuss the amount of aid they will give less developed nations to help them adopt cleaner energy technology. And there are growing expectations that meaningful progress can be made as a result of the United Nations Climate Change Conference scheduled to take place in Copenhagen next month. There is a great expectation and anticipation. Sacrifices will have to be made by all, as we said. Unfortunately, people normally perceive sacrifice as loss or surrender. Yet the root meaning of the word has less to do with going without and more to do with making sacred. Just as pollution has profound spiritual connotations related to the destruction of creation when disconnected from its creator, so too sacrifice is the necessary corrective for reducing the gold to a commodity to be exploited by our selfish appetites. When we sacrifice, we render the gold sacred, recognizing it as a gift from above to be shared with all humanity, if not equally, then at least justly. Sacrifice is ultimately an expression of gratitude for what we enjoy and humility for what we must share. For our part, in addition to our international ecological symposia, the Orthodox Church has decided to establish a Center for Environment and Peace. Hitherto, the Ecumenical Patriarchate has endeavored to raise regional and global awareness on the urgency of preserving the natural environment and promoting interreligious dialogue and understanding. Henceforth, the emphasis will be educational on the regional and international levels. The Center for Environment and Peace is planned to be housed in a historical orphanage on Büyükada, in Greek Pringippos, one of the Prince's Islands near Istanbul. The building was once the largest and most beautiful wooden edifice in Europe, and it will embody a new direction in the initiatives of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Whereas the orphanage was at one time forcibly closed by Turkish authorities in an act of religious intolerance, it is highly expected to be returned to the Ecumenical Patriarchate through a just process in the European Court of Human Rights, which ruled in favor of returning this historic property to the Ecumenical Patriarchate. The purpose of the center will be to translate theory into practice, providing educational resources to advance ecological transformation and interfaith tolerance. The center will focus on climate change and the related changes needed in human behavior and ethics. It will serve as a source of inspiration and awareness for resolving religious issues related to the environment and peace in cooperation with universities and policy centers on both local and international levels. Dear friends, as we humbly learned very early on, and as we have repeatedly stressed throughout our ministry over the last 20 years, the environment is not only a political issue, it is also, indeed, it is primarily a spiritual issue. Moreover, it directly affects all of us in the most personal and the most tangible manner. We can no longer afford to be passive observers in this crucial debate. In 2002, at the conclusion of the Adriatic Symposium, together with His Holiness, the late Pope John Paul II, we signed a declaration in Venice that proclaimed in optimism and prayer, quote, "It is not too late. God's word has incredible healing powers. Within a single generation, we could steer the earth toward our children's future. Let that generation start now. Indeed, let it start now. May God bless all of you. Thank you."
Yes, indeed. Am I authorized to tell everybody to sit down the way you do in the cathedral?
This is your cathedral.
I learned this gesture, which I don't get a chance to use around here very often, at the cathedral last week in New York. Before I escort His All Holiness out, I would make one housekeeping request and then say something of a slightly broader nature. The housekeeping request is that I would ask all of you please to stay in your seats while the patriarchal procession proceeds out so that he can make it to his next appointment. More generally, I just want to, in addition to thanking His All Holiness, make sure that he knows that I got the hint when you looked at me as you were describing the center, the new center, and its desire to cooperate with universities and institutions of this kind. Bill Antholis and I passed notes in class, which is a little rude, but it's just to make sure that we institutionally respond enthusiastically to that suggestion, and we will follow up with your colleagues. The second point, which came so clearly to my mind while listening to His All Holiness, and also in the conversation we had before joining you in here, is that his title is doubly significant. He is not just the Ecumenical Patriarch of his church. He is an ecumenical leader of the larger community of faith on many issues: peace, prosperity, human decency, and the environment. I was struck, for example, in the other room when talking to him. I asked him who his counterparts were in some other of the world's great religions, and he immediately knew exactly who we here and others might reach out to. And you are clearly a leader in putting together a truly ecumenical network on the most important issue of our time. And speaking of that most important issue, your trip here to the U.S. could not be more timely, not only in terms of global politics, but in terms of American politics. Your tour and your visit here to Brookings today has given you a chance to address civil society and also fulfill what we regard as a fundamental part of our mission here. We're .edu on the web, and that is public education. And I hope, and we will do everything we can to assure that your message today gets as much distribution as possible. As Paul mentioned, you met with the chief executive of our country. You're on your way to meet with the congressional leadership. You will be meeting with the vice president tonight. You'll be meeting with the Secretary of State tomorrow. And what we all have to hope is that your message, which you have made so forcefully and eloquently over and over, but always with a new twist, I find, and new virtue, that message will make a difference here in this country, and particularly in this town, and particularly where you're going to lunch today, because our country has unique responsibilities and also unique influence if it chooses to be part of the solution to the problem that you've spoken about. So please all join me one more time in thanking the Ecumenical Patriarch for being with us, and thank you for being here.